Digitally accessible. Digital accessibility simplified.
Now, I just want to take an opportunity to introduce our next set of speakers, Beth Somerfield and Andrew Skinner from Anthro-Tech. We're very happy to have you here, and please take it away.
So it's great to be here, and it was really good to hear the previous presentation, because it really, I think we have a lot of pieces that are just a continuation of that conversation. So I'm Beth Somerfield, and this is Andrew Skinner, and we are from a company called Anthro-Tech, which specializes in human-centered design. So most of our firm's projects are centered on research and using that design and digital, using that research to design digital products and services, and collaborating with our clients to build this human-centered process into the way that they operate and do business. So today we're going to talk about how that accessibility piece and the human-centered design piece can work together to build that more usable and accessible products. And we're going to demonstrate this by talking about a specific project that we're currently working on to help tell that story. So the project I want to talk about, our work focuses on public agencies and nonprofits and really mission-driven organizations. So for this project, we partnered with the Washington State Department of Revenue. And I can hear you already starting to fall asleep or get stressed out about taxes. But this is a really important project because Revenue brought us on board to specifically use human-centered design approach to make sure that the portal that they use to access service was accessible. And what's really got us engaged about that is that this portal is the portal that you use to do business in Washington State. It's where you get your business license, it's where you pay your taxes. It's the system that's required if you want to do business in Washington State. So this is a really key element for business in Washington State. And the goal of the project was that people doing business in Washington State can apply for their business license, they can pay their business taxes, and they can find help and communicate with the Department of Revenue if something is going wrong. So focusing in on those things really shows an important part of being a business in Washington State. So the first thing we want to talk about in this process is that we start out with our accessibility champions. And these people are the glue that hold together the project and just really builds that accountability. And who are accessibility champions? There's like a starting to be a building and ongoing conversation about what this means. And we're really excited about this project because it really highlighted the power of this group of people. They value accessibility, they invest in it, they hold their teams accountable for making sure it happens. They bring people together across the organization and the program and the team. And they focus on and in this particular group, we had representatives from customer experience, from change management, from the program staff. So our champions were from a bunch of different groups across the Department of Revenue organization. It's customer experience, it's change management and program staff and the information services staff, also developers and architects, both from within the organization and from vendors. And then the UX design team and the web content team. And then we were brought into this picture to represent research and accessibility. And one of the things to emphasize about accessibility champions is just that it doesn't matter how well you conduct an audit or do a usability study if nothing is done with those findings. So this champion group was really what supported our work in prioritizing and implementing change, and bringing in this strong support from the beginning that was something that we've built and nurtured over time with these clients has been really powerful. And it also supports the documentation on all different steps and troubleshooting and really responding to the things that we find. And we're going to talk about that as we walk through this project. So from our side, we needed to bring together people with research, accessibility, and these relationship building skills to make an impact. So Andrew, who you're going to hear from in a moment, led the project and led both the research and accessibility side, and he's really going to take a deeper dive into what that looked like. Shay partnered with Andrew and supported his work throughout that project. I supported Andrew as a sounding board, like a second brain to troubleshoot issues and to help with things like decision-making around participant recruitment. And then Suzanne, our founder and CEO, has this long-running relationship with DOR that's really helped shape that project, but also shape that team of support for both human-centered design and accessibility that really allowed this to foster the engagement and the support from these champions. So now I'm going to take you a little more into that process, and Andrew's going to have an opportunity to sort of show you the nitty-gritty of it. So we use a human-centered design approach, and this is really key to the work that we do at Anthro-Tech. And this is a design process that centers people who use products in design. And the graphics here show the 5 stages, and there's a lot of similarities between that and what you heard in the previous presentation. But what I want to emphasize here is that it's an iterative process where research with users feeds into every decision-making, and it's throughout the product life cycle. And that partnership between human-centered design centers around elements that you can bring into each of these stages of the development cycle. So for example, in research and discovery, you want to ensure to include users with disabilities in that preliminary research. And again, we heard about some of this before, so this is a really good connection. In synthesis and ideation, if you're building personas, ensure that the findings of that research are represented in the personas. The personas come from somewhere and they're inclusive. In conceptualization and ideation, you're bringing in designers who have knowledge about accessibility and testing with people who are using assistive technologies or other people with disabilities. And finally, the testing and iteration and implementation and refinement. This is where we're gonna really focus today on inclusive usability study. So I'll hold off for a moment on digging into the details of that one. So focusing in on that inclusive usability study. So here, while we're testing and iterating the system with this study, what does it look like? So an inclusive study needs to start with an accessibility audit. From there, you prioritize and you problem solve the audit findings, and then you move to the usability study that brings representative groups of people directly into working through the tasks that you're researching. And we're going to walk you through the steps as they occur in this project to give you a sense of how they fit in and how they work together and where those champions fit into that conversation. So in the accessibility audit, accessibility specialists are reviewing key task pages, reviewing the tasks, documenting accessibility issues, recommending solutions. And the goal here is to identify where the system doesn't comply with the web content accessibility guidelines and identifying issues that can be barriers to the usability study. And because we're centering people who use the systems in our research, we take a task-based approach to the audit. So we review pages that are within those key tasks that are selected based on user research of what people are doing in order to accomplish those tasks. And in this stage, in this project, we brought a subset of the accessibility champions to really be a part of the work. And the champions that were at the table for the audit, bringing the team along on the journey, and they build that collaboration. So we make sure that they're with us in each step. So for this example, we had this small internal project team. And that included the customer experience group, the change managers, user experience designers, web content team, and also our research and accessibility group. And the value in this is things like shouting out our customer manager, Eileen, came to the table with a foundation for our work of documented task flows and tested a test environment that we could work in, and troubleshooting documentation for when things didn't work. So having them collaboratively working with us on this journey really made the audit more impactful, because we knew what people were using in this process, and we knew that the work that came out of it was going to be used and was going to be able to be integrated back into the development and design cycles. So now I'm going to hand this over to Andrew, and he's going to dig a little more into what that audit process looked like.
Great, thank you so much, Beth, for that great introduction. So at the beginning of this project, we were provided with a selected list of tasks from our project group that we were going to look at doing during this audit and during this engagement, and wonderfully documented. Again, I have to shout out Eileen again for wonderfully documenting and setting us off on the right foot. And as I was going through, I did some initial discovery process to see what's sort of like the complexity of the pages, how long might it take to get through to audit some of these things. And what we decided to do was break the work down into these weekly audit cycles, where we would break down the several different workflows into multiple weeks. And then each week I would go through and conduct the audit itself, doing pretty standard conformance to WCAG 2.1 AA using manual testing, screen reader testing, as well as some automated tools for testing as well. And each week we would bring this core team together and debrief on the findings that were had for just that one particular week. And the advantages of doing this sort of iterative breakdown of audit, rather than kind of doing just like, hey, auditor, go off and do the audit and then come back with a huge list of issues, is it really helps keep the whole team involved and collaborating as part of the process, because we don't want this to be just us, working on things and then throwing something over the wall and then it's like, okay, here you go. We want them to be involved in seeing the issues as they're coming through, work through and talk about the issues as they're coming through. So it helped keep people engaged in the process, and also just made the work more manageable. And because we were doing this iterative way of working through the audit, we were incrementally building the findings sheet, which allowed us also to bring in additional people that may be in charge of one particular part of the system for just that week, which was relevant to maybe they own that particular workflow, for example. And so they didn't have to like sit through a much larger representation of multiple findings. They could be just very targeted at what they were in charge of. And so as we were going through the process, all of this is getting documented in a very large Excel central spreadsheet. On the screen here is a screenshot of the actual spreadsheet that we had been building for this project. The left-hand side of the spreadsheet is largely made up of where a lot of the documenting of issues comes in. So each issue is given a unique issue ID. We record what page that issue was found on, what the element was, briefly describe the issue and severity of that issue. And then on the right side is where a lot of the references are had for what actual criteria is this aligning to? Is it aligning just to a best practice? Is there a specific WCAG criteria? Is there a state requirement? Things like that. And then later on in the process, the project core team was also able to expand this spreadsheet to an even larger spreadsheet and use it as a means of accountability and tracking the status of resolution of issues, what the current state of, if they've put a ticket in to get something fixed, they could track that here as well. And everything was kind of in this core large document, which was primarily used by our internal core team, also a lot of developers as well. But it's a very detailed document. It's very dense. There's a lot going on in here. So during these weekly debriefs with the internal team, I would also create some annotated visuals as well. Typically, I would pull some screenshots while it's going through the audit, or in some cases, even just go directly into the system and go to the page that an issue might be on. And this helps connect that issue finding from the text, from just a description in a spreadsheet, to actually seeing it in the context of the system, and also being able to see it in context of the flow of which it's happening into like the actual task location that it's in as well. And the purpose of doing doing the visual is just also just to make it more manageable to explain and show issues, but also builds that context and helps build that understanding of why this is an issue and why it needs to be fixed. So the example that I have on the screen here is we were talking about an inconsistent design pattern that was found on the form. On this particular page in the form, the page structure has a heading starting at the top of the page and the content falls below, which is kind of what people would expect, especially using assistive technology. But then on the next page, just a little bit later on in the form, the issue was that the heading was no longer starting at the top of the page. There was content preceding that heading. And as we actually would also find in our usability study, a lot of assistive technology users would often not see that, would not get to that information above the heading because they were starting at that first heading and working down. And so just being able to provide that context of, from a visual user perspective, this seems like it's fine, you'd be able to orient just fine, but people that are using assistive technology are not experiencing this in the same way. And you need to make sure that your design patterns are consistent so they don't have to continue to reorient with every new page.
And this is something that we see pretty often with clients, is the issues that come up in the audit. And another example I can think of was a corporate client where the fields weren't properly labeled, and we called this out in the audit, but it wasn't getting traction. That people weren't seeing the importance of what that impact could be. And so in that case, we included that is part of the usability study so that it could be demonstrated and seen the impact that has on users. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go into this process. So the next step that we had in this microcycle during the audit was the prioritization and problem solving. And this was done with that weekly accessibility working group, and it brought together research, development, and vendors. And it was there to collaboratively review issues and build a common understanding of what the solutions to those issues would be. So our goals with that group were to start prioritizing the work, to identify issues that could be fixed before the usability study, and to agree on issues to explore within the usability study to really focus those research questions in. So for this group, we went back to the larger group of accessibility champions. So we brought the whole team together that I mentioned earlier and our group presented our findings and recommendations based on guidelines. The customer experience team members provided customer context and things like language and customer needs. The developers from the Department of Revenue and from the vendor who supported some of the elements of the portal were in the room to talk about how solutions were feasible and how they could be implemented, and then also the timelines of that implementation. The UX design and web content helped problem solve the user experience issues. And then those change managers were present in the room with that long-term perspective to speak about how the bigger changes and things that needed to be implemented over time could get brought into the work process of fixing and changing larger issues of how the system functioned. So it was this place where we worked together to build that shared understanding and decide where we needed more research and start planning how and when these changes would be implemented. And Andrew's going to now share an example of what that looked like.
Yeah, so as we were working in these weekly working group meetings, there would often be these situations that would come up where we would go through and talk about the findings. We would show examples of the findings. And on the screen here, I have an example of one of the ones that we had a discussion about with the technical team, with the vendor team, that just needed a little bit of clarification for them, a little bit of more context building of why this was listed as an issue. On the screen here, I have a screenshot of one part of the form that has an error that has popped up. In this particular instance, this error pops up automatically, like as soon as you make the error, then the error populates on the screen. And they had a good idea already of what the issue could be when they were seeing it in context of how I had it described in the audit, but they just needed that little bit of clarification of when looking only at this page from a visual perspective, it seems like everything is fine. People can see that the error comes up when they make an issue. The error is fairly descriptive. It puts it next to the form field. The problem was, though, is this is not the way that assistive technology users are experiencing that same error when it comes up. And by building that context that for an assistive technology user, because this error was added after the page loads, it's adding it to the bottom of the reading order. And so they're not seeing that, they're not getting that information about that error unless they go all the way down to the bottom of their reading order to be able to access that error itself. So with how the technical implementation of this page was, of how that error was being generated, for an assistive technology user, it's all the way at the bottom. And unless they happen to go all the way down to the bottom of the reading order, which is kind of unnatural typically to go even beyond the, like they would have to actually, in this case, go beyond even like the next button, which is typically the last place they would go on the form field to actually be able to access that error with how it was implemented. Additionally, the error was not being announced to the screen reader when it was coming up as well, or was not doing so consistently across different screen readers. So just by building that context that, you know, the way that it's visually displayed on the screen, it does not match necessarily with how an assistive technology like a screen reader will read or access that information in sort of the same way. And kind of a similar format, kind of a similar issue we talked about, and this was actually an example that was brought up during a larger kind of executive meeting as well. Very, very similar situation here on the screen. I have there's actually two screenshots here from two separate parts of the form. On the top, there's a checkbox with the services labeled next to it. And then on the bottom, there's a set of 4 radio buttons with some business types next to it. From a visual perspective, again, it looks like, you know, you can visually orient that there's a label next to the button. If you're able to visually see the screen, you know what you're clicking on. However, the way that the implementation of these controls was not consistent throughout the form. So on the top, if you were using assistive technology and you clicked on that services checkbox, it would read out services checkbox checked. So you knew exactly what you were activating, you knew exactly what you were checking. However, in the bottom example with the radio buttons, because the label was not programmatically associated directly with the control, if you selected one of those radio buttons, it would just announce as radio button checked. But what radio button did I check? And we saw this come up a lot in the usability testing where people would need to navigate back and forth to like try to discover what the label was. And sometimes they would actually click the radio button below because they thought that the radio buttons were after the label or before the label. So it was very confusing and frustrating for people because it didn't just announce directly when they selected the specific button. So building that understanding of why this is such an issue and why it would be such a frustrating experience is really helpful for people that may not have as much background in accessibility or may not, you know, have that perspective of how assistive technology may experience pages like this. And then as we were going through as well, you know, we're thinking about what's like technical feasibility, what can we get fixed in, you know, what's the timeframes to get things fixed. And we would come across some pages that just had sort of a laundry list of issues associated with them. This is one particular page that we were talking about quite a bit from a technical feasibility and a remediation perspective. On the screen, I have another form. It's a table with several checkboxes in the right column, and there's sort of a visual representation over the top of the tab order. And by default, this page comes up with about 600 list items within this very large table, and you can use the filter to filter it down. But it's a really rough tab order. The interaction design is a little complex. A lot of the checkboxes have that same issue of the label not being associated. Needless to say, there were multiple issues that this page had. And so this was an example of a page that we removed from the running for doing usability testing on, because we knew that the accessibility support just was not there. And we knew that people were just going to be running into that accessibility barrier too much to be able to test anything else about this page. And so we removed this from testing.
Yeah, and this is, again, something that we come up with, or we come across on a lot of projects. I mean, those earlier examples where it was a matter of collaborating with the team that we were bringing along on the journey. We've had another recent one with a state agency website where in the audit, we caught and tab and accordion elements that weren't using a standard design pattern. And we collaborated with the developers during that prioritization stage and got those things fixed so that when we got to the usability study, our participants got to really dig into what the user experience was rather than getting caught up and getting stuck in an accordion that wasn't properly structured. And another example of this page that with a really complex tab order that you're looking at right now is a recent study with a transit app where our audit discovered a keyboard trap where people wouldn't be able to, navigating with a keyboard, wouldn't be able to get past a modal that popped up. And the developers that we were working with said, we get it, we understand it. It needs to be fixed. We can't do it right now. It'll take too long before the study. So we refocused the study to skip that task in order to make sure that our participants weren't just getting stuck and weren't able to actually participate in the study. So that takes us into the study. So during a usability study, researchers observe how real users work on tasks in the system, observe what people are doing, and then we record things like how many tasks were successfully completed, how easy or difficult is it to complete those tasks, how long did they take, what were common errors, action with using the system. And our goals in the study are to validate and support the issues found in the audit. And it's to identify where the system doesn't work for users, things that are usability issues that are not easily found in an audit. Things like unfamiliar language is an example, or the complexity of an interaction. Being able to work with users gets you a much better understanding of the issues and the nuance of the issues than the audit makes possible. So for this section, we shrunk back down to that small core group of collaborators just for during the usability study. And again, it was making sure that this research wasn't happening in a bubble, that the team was coming along on the research part of the journey and wasn't just there to be handed over some findings. So in this part, that core working team of the customer experience, change manager, UX designer, web content, and our research and accessibility team, we tracked and confirmed issues that were being fixed before the study. We used the audit to shape the research as it was coming forward. We set up the study to be inclusive, and then we share and track the findings as they occur. And Andrew's going to give you again some of that, how this functioned and how the team worked together on it.
Yeah, so as we got into working through all those prioritization of issues, we started to understand what was going to be able to be fixed before it. We knew some things were not going to be fixed. We knew that some things would affect people, but may affect people in different ways. And so the nice thing about doing the audit first is it helped us identify those issues, like we saw in that earlier example, where we knew that it was just going to be a complete blocker, and we don't want to set people up to just immediately fail a task or have extreme struggles to work through a task. And so it helped us identify those issues that we knew was not worth bringing in front of people to test until the core accessibility issues were fixed or for that particular issue. When we were looking through the findings as well, kind of as Beth mentioned as well, there's like the technical accessibility issues of how do buttons work, how do forms work, how are the labels announced. But then you also have some of the content side about how is the language, like what level is the language at, how understandable is the actual labeling itself, how understandable is the content itself. And so for the purposes of this particular study and for the scope of the study that we were doing here, we decided to focus more on the technical accessibility, so we could focus just for this particular study on more of the implementation of those accessibility, from a technical perspective. And we really wanted to be able to measure the differences in that experience, because there are a lot of issues that come up during the audit where it's especially those like moderate severity issues where it's like, well, it could slow someone down, or people may experience an issue, but what does that actually look like when you actually bring people in? And that's the beauty of doing the usability study in conjunction with the accessibility audit, is you're able to actually get that firsthand experience of what is it actually like now that we've implemented the accessibility. What does it actually look like for people to be working through those tasks now that they have that accessibility support? And so we went through and started setting up the inclusive usability study. And we wanted to be very mindful about how we were setting up the study itself, because our study itself needs to be accessible. We need to make sure we're getting people involved in the study who, match the criteria that we're looking for to study for this particular testing session. And we want to make sure that the researchers and people working on the study are familiar with assistive technology and familiar with how people with disabilities. So you have that context of as you're working with them, you're doing so in a mindful and respectful way, and making sure they can be successful to participate in your study. And so we focused our criteria in particular to look at more of the mechanics of the page, and less so about, do you understand Washington State business licensing and tax law and things like that, right? It was less about, do you understand what the form is, what it means, and more, is the form actually working with your assistive technology to announce what the label is? We have a whole separate future work thinking about looking at additional usability testing to look more at content side of things to help work on some of that stuff as well. And we created a screener to help focus on a very specific focus on assistive technology for this particular study, because we wanted to focus the study in such a way that it wasn't kind of just very broad and only having like one person from one particular type of assistive technology. It's hard to get like good representative sample if you only have one type of disability, and if because one person can only speak for one person, right? And as we were going through the recruitment process, we used experienced recruiters. So there's a lot of recruitment firms out there that you can use to recruit people for usability study. The one that we used, it specializes in recruiting people with disabilities for participating in usability studies. They also run usability studies with people with disabilities. So they're a pretty well-renowned, pretty well-known organization in the accessibility industry. And then we made sure that we were managing the logistics appropriately, making sure we were communicating with these participants once we got them from the recruiter to make sure that they had all the information that they needed. We made sure we did technology checks so that they could participate effectively during the study itself. And as we started going through and working in the actual study and working with these people in the study, the thing that we're finding, and the thing that I want to reiterate again is, the accessibility audit is great at documenting if things are matching to accessibility standards. But as Beth kind of mentioned earlier as well, it does not really document the human experience of actually working through those tasks. So accessibility support and accessibility implementation is there to help support someone in having that equivalent user experience and being able to work through those same tasks. Someone who is going to the DOR site using assistive technology, they're there to complete the same tasks as everybody else. They have the same goals to submit a business license, to do a tax return. And so they should be able to work through those tasks just as good of ease of use, have just as high of satisfaction using the site, be able to work through it at a reasonable speed, just as everybody else. And that's where you really get that observational data from getting that experience of specific people in the usability study. So by observing them directly, you can see how is our implementation of those standards helping people work through those actual tasks, and are we meeting that standard of accessibility, but also the usability of, are they able to work through it easily in conjunction with having that accessibility support? And we quickly saw that the severity of issues is different between different people. So people, the fact that someone is using assistive technology or may have a particular disability, that's just one thing that makes up who they are. There's multiple other things that make up who that person is. They have different lived experience. They have different things that make up who they are. What's happening that day can affect how they might interact with the system. And that's where you get a lot of that core human experience of someone working through the site by using that usability study. And so on the next slide, one kind of in particular thing, I think this might have been touched on in the prior presentation as well, is, even within the same assistive technology, people can work through inaccessible sites, and kind of sorry to say that a lot of them are used to working through inaccessible sites because they experience it quite frequently. But in particular, in our group of users that we were testing with, we had a number of people that were like very expert, like technical experts in accessibility, like IT accessibility, web accessibility experts. Like they're in the industry, they're they have a lot of technical background, and they have this knowledge to draw on where they know what the interaction of this page should be like. So they can troubleshoot and they can work around issues. They're very adept at using the assistive technology, even on sites that don't have the appropriate support. But conversely, and this is where usability testing is so useful, especially when you get that wide representation of users, is for some of our users who did not have that technical background, what was being presented to them through their technology, that's all there was for them. They could only work with what's being presented to them through the technology. They don't have that perspective of, oh, this is how this design pattern should work on a form, and I know a modal probably popped up that has an error in it, so I know I probably have to go to the end of the reading order. Like for them, whatever was being announced, that's the only thing they have to orient them. And so they would often get fully stuck on tasks and would need support, or would not be able to complete a task that they were working on, where the technical users could work through it because they had that context to work through.
And again is a common example of something we run into. And in that example, I talked about earlier about teams not recognizing the importance of form labels. When we got non-technical users into the study, demonstrating the pain of seeing a screen reader go through a form and read blank, 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 blank instead of the form labels, the developers, the technical team immediately jumped back in and said, oh, wow, these non-technical users are the people that we want to serve with this product, and they got it fixed. So the next step, we want to talk a little about the work with the Department of Revenue project that's still underway, and share where we are now and how we're keeping the momentum going with our champions and some of the things we learned in that process. Andrew?
Yeah. So yeah, what's happening right now actually is we're currently in the process of analyzing the results from that usability study that I just talked about and developing the reporting and presentations from that. We actually just recently completed that study. DOR, meanwhile, is continuing to work on a lot of pending issues, a lot of pending tickets that were submitted as part of the audit. There's some issues that have a longer time frame to fix, especially if it's it has to go over to like a vendor who has to change their core product. So there's a lot of issues where some things are currently in work, some are in testing. So we're continuing to sort of monitor and work on those issues as they're being fixed. And kind of going forward, we're really kind of encouraging to continue monitoring and managing the accountability of the accessibility work in progress. And I think this is a really important thing, having worked on many audits in the past, is, you can go through the process of, sometimes you'll get that initial jump start of, you get the audit, you get the usability study, you're handing stuff off, people are excited. Oh, but then something else comes up, and then all of a sudden everything gets pushed into the backlog, and then it, dies in the backlog and doesn't it just will sit there forever kind of thing. So continue pushing the importance and continue enforcing the accountability of that. These are not things that can just sit in the backlog. Don't create more accessibility debt of creating new sites with more accessibility issues because you're not correcting the issues that would have been, had that context if you fixed it from the previous issues that you had in the backlog. And then we already talked a little bit about doing additional usability testing in the future, also with people of different types of disabilities, with multiple disabilities. One thing we're particularly looking at is a lot of the cognitive accessibility, especially looking at some of the content side of the site to try to make it a little bit easier to work through the forums and understand the information that's being presented. And so there's a lot of kind of future talks about continuing this process of that iterative usability testing and rolling that back into that iterative process of improving the site. But as always, there's things we would do differently as things come up. With this particular project, and this comes up quite frequently is just being able to understand the depth and need of the recruitment profiles you need a little bit earlier is very helpful. In our particular case, initially we had like quite constrained recruitment profiles. And when we went to hand them off to the auditor, or sorry, to the recruiter, they were like, yeah, it's going to take a little bit. We don't even know if this many people kind of exist in the world. It's like, it's like a little bit too specific. And so, we went back to that core group again and kind of, had some more conversations. And, it was kind of like, we were being a little bit too specific. Really, the thing we're looking at in this particular study is the mechanics. It doesn't matter if they are in a specific location or a very specific business kind of type. So we loosened up the recruitment profiles a little bit to make it more reasonable to actually find people that would match those things. So be realistic also about your recruitment profiles. One of the things I mentioned is we had quite a few expert participants in our recruitment, which is fine. It's okay to have expert recruiters. I think we had perhaps a little bit too high of a percentage of expert recruiters, and we wanted to have a little bit more representation across that range of expertise, because not everybody that uses your site will be an expert in accessibility, an expert in digital web development. So we want to include those people that may not have that background in that technical expertise. And then also just including a wider range of assistive technology. And I think there's opportunity to do additional tests in the future where we can work with additional assistive technology types in future testing to continue to look through at those other things as well.
So I just want to wrap this up and just sort of pull out some of the key points for you to walk away with. And that is that human-centered design puts users first. So it centers user needs in the development process to create useful and usable products and services. And it only works if it's inclusive and recognizes the diverse needs of users. So including people with disabilities in design activities throughout the process is what builds those more accessible experiences. And then together, that accessibility audits and inclusive usability studies find more of those accessibility issues and help people better understand what those issues are. It helps teams to understand and prioritize and really plan their work to have more impact for the people who are using the system. And then it supports those accessibility champions as they advocate for organizational change, because it keeps users with disabilities in the design process. It helps those team members step outside of their own experiences, and it provides that solid data to back change and influence that decision-making process. So thank you so much for having us here today. I really want to thank Digitally Accessible for inviting us. And I just want to shout out that it's great to be celebrating Global Accessibility Awesomeness Day. In our internal conversations at Anthro-Tech, we've been calling it Global Accessibility Awesomeness Day, just because it's a great opportunity not just to look at awareness, but also to celebrate the amazing work that people are doing and how people working in the accessibility field are making an impact. And we really need to remind ourselves of that and sort of take moments to pause and appreciate, because it's hard work and sometimes doesn't feel like we're rolling the boulder. So thank you so much for having us.
Beth and Andrew, thank you so much for accepting to be part of our Accessibility Awareness Day event. We're very, very happy to have you. And I think right now we're going to open to questions from the attendees.
Okay, we have three questions from Anonymous. On the spreadsheet Andrew Skinner showed, there were columns for pages and type. What options for type are there other than global site?
Yeah, so in this particular portal that we were working with, there were some issues that came up that were, we called them global site issues, because there were a lot of reused components that are used in several parts of the site, or it was a common issue throughout the form site. So we would call out specific global issues. But then there are also sites that are owned by different people. And so it's like, it was a very an internal specific thing for how the architecture of the site was set up. to help them orient on, this is like the global site that's owned by this group, or this is the part of the site that's owned by this group. It might be an internal page, it might be a form page, it might be a separate part of the portal. So it was just to help orient from the internal location of the actual page itself on who's in charge of that part of the site, essentially, and what sort of the expanse of that issue might be.
Okay, the second question is, have you ever found it impossible to remediate a web page to make it accessible to a screen reader user? And if not, what was the most difficult problem you can remember solving for a screen reader user?
I've got a good example of that one that's from outside this project. We had a Tableau dashboard that we were asked to review. And I think probably I'm not the only one with this experience, where we got into it and we're just like, oh my gosh, this was done in a way that is just not going to work. You can't fix this. You have to start over. And we documented tons of issues and we showed them the experience that folks were having. And I walked away from the project thinking, we don't have the core momentum on this one with the team to get this fixed. And it was very discouraging, but we did bring them along on the journey. And after we left, that really took the air out of my balloon. But I went back as a person working in a business in Washington State later to just as a user to use the dashboard, and was like, oh, I have to go to this thing and it's awful. And they fixed it. They'd blown it up and taken out and totally revamped it from top to bottom. And I just did the happiest dance. So even with those cases where you walk away and go, I am documenting, I am rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. There are those moments where you're like, but if you show them those deck chairs and really demonstrate how impactful that is and bring leadership into the conversation and get that movement, it can move. So yeah, there are definitely ones that don't go, but it doesn't mean it's an unfixable problem.
What is the name of the well-known recruiting firm that you use to recruit testers with disabilities?
Yeah, so we very proudly worked with Nobility to do the recruiting. We also have worked with several other firms as well for doing recruiting with people with disabilities. But not a sponsored message by Nobility, but highly recommend them. They were great to work with on this particular project, and I'm sure we'll be working with them on more in the future.
That's all the questions I see.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So Beth and Andrew, thank you again. Is there any way people can reach out to you or to your organization after the event?
Yeah, the best way to reach me, and I think Andrew, chime in if this isn't for you, is just in LinkedIn. My last name is spelled Somerfield, and that quirky spelling makes me, I think, one of the only Beth Somerfields out there. So, and I'd love to connect with you and hear more about the work that you're doing as well.
Yeah, same. I'm definitely not the only Andrew Skinner. It's a pretty common, it's a pretty common name. So make sure you find the one that works at Anthro-Tech, and you'll see my face on there too. So, but yeah, LinkedIn is a good place to connect, and I'm always happy to connect with people that want to chat more about accessibility or usability or any of that. I'm always happy to chat.